So, today I'm going to make a keyboard that looks like this out of this. I'm going to turn this block of wood into a full-on keyboard, a fully functional 10-keyless keyboard with a case made from a solid piece of wood, with hopefully a fit and finish similar to a precision-crafted high-end keyboard, but without losing the handmade touch, which is just an excuse for me to have some room for mistakes. Unfortunately, I don't have a CNC machine, table saw, or bandsaw, but I do have my hands, a lack of woodworking skills, a router I bought last minute from Home Depot, a scroll saw that I ask way too much of, some used sandpaper for hand sanding, an orbital sander ready to give me arthritis, and some patience that I had to open a loan for because the APRs are low and I just don't have enough. So join me on this journey that took way more time than initially anticipated. It's a big risk not knowing if this will work, so let's see how this is gonna go. This here is a piece of spalted maple. Spalted maple is essentially maple that is partially decaying, giving off these dark character lines throughout the wood you see here, which is usually caused by a fungus. I got this in the scrap bin of one of my favorite places to shop for unique pieces of wood called Rescue Wood Rehab. Seriously, a fantastic place to visit in North Carolina near the Triangle. I highly recommend them. Luckily, they are able to cut a 7-degree typing angle into the bottom of the case with the table saw they had at the shop. They also gave me the scrap piece from the cut to use as a foot towards the back of the case. A side-by-side profile against one of my other keyboards really shows how much of a thick boy this keyboard is going to be, and I love it. They also ripped a 1/2 inch off the top of the wood so I can cut and mill the dimensions needed for fitting the components inside. This is the PCB that was sent to me by accident from a keyboard I ordered a while ago from KBD fans. I have no idea which keyboard it belongs to, but I assume the KBD 8X. Anyways, this is really where the process begins. I made a cardboard cutout of some dimensions I measured earlier from a different board, and they were ever so slightly off to fit with this PCB. So I mapped out all the edges of the key clusters and measured the distance from keycap to keycap with a 1/16 of an inch clearance on each cluster. Let me tell you, you don't experience real fun until you do that. Oh, and I also had to make sure the internals would sit at the correct depth inside the top portion of the case to have the bottom of the keycaps flush with the surface. Does your head hurt? Mine sure did. First up, I'm going to start with the top of the case. So in order to get those keycaps at the right height, I need to make sure that the plate and PCB can fit inside as well. To do this, I'll be channeling out a certain depth using my hand router. To make sure I get the right depth, I measured the length of the drill bit and marked it with masking tape. This serves as both a pilot hole and a depth standard for the router bit. With that set and my router guide jig, I was ready to start routing. Once I had all sides routed out, I used my color in the line skills to essentially get the rest of the shape cut out. Next, it was on to drilling out the pilot holes for each key cluster that I had to cut out with the scroll saw. I passed the blade of the scroll saw through the pilot hole and began my journey onto one of the most nerve-wracking and tedious cutouts of my life. The corners were tight, and I had to concentrate on keeping the blade on center with the pencil line to keep every cut as straight as possible. This was a make it or break it point for the build. If this cut didn't turn out, or if I had made any significant error, I would have just cut out a giant rectangle and screwed the PCB into the wood and called it a day. Luckily, that did not happen here. Anyways, it's time for a test fit to make sure it aligns with the key clusters. And it does, surprisingly without any contact with pressing the keys down. And if it did, that would just be filed down to fit. The next thing I did was work on the foot of the case. This serves as leveling out the keyboard at its 7-degree typing angle. I measured the angle at the back of the case and surprisingly made this cut with the scroll saw. And without any sanding, this board sits pretty flush on the workbench. With some sanding, I'll reduce any minor wobbles that may incur while typing. Now that the top portion of the case is mostly finished in terms of cutting, it was time to get some nice edges around the perimeter of the board. Using the hand router, again, I rounded out the corners with an even bevel all the way around. This gave it a more finished look than I was initially anticipating. I also burned some of the wood by moving the router too fast on the end grain sides, but good thing I love the smell of burnt maple. And also it can be sanded out, of course. Afterwards, I moved to the lower portion of the case and sanded out the saw marks on the outside facing edges. This is the plate I'll be using for the build, and it's a universal plate from Cannonkeys made from FR4. Unfortunately, the top row doesn't line up with the PCB, so I'll be going back to that scroll saw once again. And also, for some reason, this plate is insanely tight with fitting switches of any kind into the cutouts. So at the expense of my own sanity, I decided to file down each and every cutout. I'll also be cutting off these screw hole mounts since they don't line up the way I need them to. After I lost my mind for the third time this week, I moved on to making the cutout for the USB-C at the back of the case. This was again channeled out using the hand router and was done to both the top and bottom pieces of the case. Once I had everything lined up with the PCB inside the case, I marked down the mounting points, because nothing says precision like using a Sharpie and the focus of 2 AM on a work night. After all the mounting points were marked, I made room for the standoffs and drilled out 6mm of depth to seat the PCB at the correct height. This screw-on collar for my drill bit came in very handy for a more accurate drill depth. Now it's time to channel out the rest of the inside of the bottom case. This depth will be shallower than the pilot holes for the standoffs. And lucky for me, once I finished this step, I realized I marked the mounting positions with the PCB upside down. Anyways, I clamped down the case and lined it up to sand down and even out the edges between the top and bottom portions of the case. Then it was onto drilling out the holes for the case assembly screws. This was done by hand, and I'm so glad I didn't drill a hole too diagonal to properly screw in. A drill press would have been really helpful here, but that's just weak compared to my masking tape drill bits. To add to the quality of the build, I added threaded inserts for the case so this could be taken apart and put back together reliably. I wanted to get a basic piece of branding on the bottom of this case to make it mine. I thought about chiseling, but I'm just not at that skill set yet. So I decided to take on some pyrography to burn my logo into the wood. Next, I had to cut out the pieces of the plate to fit the PCB properly and also make room for the mounting points. At this point, I was just waiting for the standoffs to come in, so I made my final touches to the case and prepped it for a tung oil finish. This Spalted maple is quite dark for maple, and I love it. A natural finish really brings out the beauty of it. I only did 2 coats of this since more coats would give this a shiny finish. I picked up this piece of maple from Rescue Wood Rehab again to make this wrist rest. This is pure maple, so no fungal decay. This will offer a nice contrast to the board as it is much lighter in tone. Finally, this is where I start putting the pieces together. I'll be using these Durock Anubis switches, which provide a nice deep sound and rounded tactile feel. Also, I think the colors suit the build as well. I lubed the stem and bottom housing with Krytox 205 grade 0 and the springs with Krytox 105, and each switch was filmed with Deskeys films. These modifications will tighten the upper and lower housings of the switch, deepen the sound, remove any scratch or spring noise, and smoothen the feel for the Anubis switch. By the time I finished modifying the switches, the standoffs had finally arrived. I drilled out the pilot holes for the threading of the standoff, then started screwing in the thread by hand. This took a lot of trial and error to make sure each standoff aligned with the PCB mounting points. I also lost my sanity here as well, so that makes it the 4th time this week. After having all the hardware installed with the case, it was back to the assembly. I Holee modded these Durock V2 stabilizer stems to reduce wire rattle. For those who don't know, it basically takes this piece of bandage material to go inside the stem to act as a pad for the wire to rest on. Lubing the stabilizer wire also helps with rattle as well, which I used Krytox 205 grade 0 for. I then placed down the same bandage material on the PCB to reduce rattle, which is also known as a band-aid mod. To add to this, I put on stabilizer foam on top of the band-aid mod to really tighten and dampen the stabilizers. The next modification included PE foam cut out to the shape of the PCB to act as a sound dampener between the PCB and the switches. Then it was on to soldering all 87 switches in, which was probably the easiest part of this entire process. It was a true relief to get to this stage. After that was finished, I placed a single layer of masking tape under the PCB to deepen the sound of the keystrokes. To add to this, I cut up pieces of Sorbothane to put inside the case. This will help with the hollow sound signature from within the case without ruining the sound profile of wood. Each assembly screw hole in the case has a portion channeled out to make sure the top of the case sits flush, and so that I can add these rubber O-rings to reduce vibrations between the top and bottom halves. I also added these foam gaskets to help with this. The last pieces of the puzzle were to install the assembly screws to join the 2 halves together and install the foot of the case. Not gonna lie, this was really satisfying to have it put together. Now, let's see what this looks like.
Oh my goodness. That sounds so good.
I'm honestly surprised at how well this came out and how it sounds. The keycaps sit at the correct height. They're mostly even on each side as well. I couldn't have asked for a better result. I did not expect this to turn out this nice. This is probably my favorite keyboard of all time because of the journey it took me on just making it. Knowing this is a one-of-one case, truly unique by my own hands, also adds to that. However, next time I hope I have a CNC wood router. One of the finer skills I learned from this experience was ultimately patience. Measuring, planning, and taking my time really helped this turn out. Let me know what you guys want me to tackle on next time. I'm up for all sorts of layouts. And if you're in the area, again, make sure to check out Rescue Wood Rehab. Consider subscribing and checking out the rest of the channel. I'll see you guys soon.